an important topic regarding the international relations of the Eurasian space. The format for today, each of the speakers will have 9 minutes. I will give a 1-minute warning, 1 minute left, and then I will give you the time signal so that we have time for everyone to participate. Our discussants will have 10 minutes each. We'll just proceed in the order of the program. And so we will start with Professor Alexander Korolev, who is Deputy Head of the Eurasian Sector at the Harvard School of Economics. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Professor. Dear colleagues, it's a great pleasure to be here and present our thoughts. So actually, my presentation will be devoted to the Eurasian Economic Union foreign economic strategy and how to unlock the potential of Eurasian Economic Union. So first of all, when we talk about the development of Eurasian Economic Union in terms of the foreign policy, foreign economic policy, we should say that for the first 5 years, Eurasian Economic Union was quite successful, or at least quite active, right? And the list of record in terms of dealing with foreign partners was quite extensive. It's free trade agreement with Vietnam. Yes, it's kind of controversial, and the results, the preliminary results of this free trade agreement are still mixed. But still, it's the first one, right? It's the first one, so it is a fuel towards the development of further relationship and trying to test the major mechanisms of free trade agreement. Then it's, of course, the free trade agreement with Singapore, Serbia, different tracks with Iran, preliminary trade agreement with Iran, even the non-preferential trade agreement with China could be regarded as, let's say, the future asset towards the development of Eurasian Economic Union foreign economic strategy. But at the same time, we definitely have to say that one of the strategic advantage and assets of the Eurasian Economic Union was its youth, right? Because the Eurasian Economic Union is still a very young organization, right? It's just 5 years, or let's say 6 years. So actually, arguably, all the trade agreements and even the memorandum of understandings with different trade organizations like ASEAN, or Mercosur were regarded by the Eurasian Economic Commission as a success. Of course, it's not, but still, during to the youth of the Eurasian Economic Union, it's still a feature of Eurasian integration. But as for the challenges for Eurasian economic integration, there are several challenges actually. Despite all the progress in developing its ties with foreign partners, and one of the challenges is the administrative challenge. Because the Eurasian Economic Commission, as being the major agent of the, let's say, the greater Eurasian partnership in terms of the economy, in terms of integration, is still very limited in its capacity. It's very limited in terms of its functioning. So currently, the Eurasian Economic Commission can negotiate with foreign partners only on trade, no services, no investments. So that's why it's a huge actual limitations in terms of the development of Eurasian economic integration itself. In Eurasian Economic Union indeed. The other challenge, of course, is the very limited structure of export structure, right? So currently, 54% of all the trade which go beyond the territories of Eurasian Economic Union countries, member states, is actual mineral resources, right? So that's why it's one of the major limitations currently. Is the very limited structure of export. And 80% are the intermediate goods. So that's why, of course, Eurasian Economic Union has to make a structural diversification of its economy in order to squeeze into this greater Eurasian partnership and be on the same page, be on the same line with different associations like ASEAN or different countries like South Korea or Japan or and definitely China in terms of exporting its goods to other countries. The other is actually we can call it arguably, but we can call it the integration race, because currently the different also trade blocs, trade organizations like ASEAN, Mercosur, or European Union, of course they have some kind of limitations and issues currently, but they have already switched their foreign economic policies, foreign economic strategies from the classical free trade agreements to the more sophisticated and more complex, which are called the free trade agreement plus, right, which is actually a general trend of the liberalization in Greater Eurasia and in more broader perspective. But as for the Eurasian Economic Union, it's still very limited. It's still, let's say, very conservative in its foreign economic policy, with only free trade agreements which are classical, but not the sophisticated, not the advanced ones like the ASEAN have or different other trade associations. The other structural factor is the signature of the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Of course, the Eurasian Economic Union, neither Eurasian Economic Union nor the separate member states of the Eurasian Economic Union are not participants of the RCEP. And this is actually the problem, right? We can say it, we can call it a problem, a structural limitation. Why? Because RCEP is about the mechanism. RCEP is a game changer. Of course, once it ratified, because currently it's just the signature in 2020 without any ratification. So RCEP is about the trade rules. Is about the fixing or handling the so-called noodle bowl effect. The RCEP is actually collectively RCEP is the second largest partner for the Eurasian Economic Union, which comprises of 30% of all the exports of Eurasian Economic Union go to the RCEP member states. And actually all the major, besides of course the European Union, major partners of the Eurasian Economic Union are the countries of RCEP, China, ASEAN, Japan, South Korea, right? So this is actually another structural limitation, and definitely neither Russia nor the Eurasian Economic Union itself are ready for the RCEP negotiations, because the Eurasian Economic Union does not have the free trade agreement with ASEAN, and in foreseeable future there is no chances actually for Eurasian Economic Union to sign, even to negotiate on RCEP with ASEAN because of the different matters. And one of this, actually, ASEAN is not really interested in the Eurasian Economic Union in terms of the free trade agreement. Currently, the ASEAN is much more interested in the European Union and Canada, which is the current agenda in terms of foreign economic policy of ASEAN. So maybe someone argue that I just described this negative future or kind of the negative landscape of Eurasian Economic Union. It's not that. It's actually the realism. It's not like it's very pragmatic things. And in my final words, my final timing, I would say, so how to unlock the Eurasian Economic Union for an economic potential. So one can argue that Eurasian Economic Union should actually rush into the negotiations with different countries like South Korea, ASEAN, maybe European Union in terms of signing free trade agreements. Yeah, one can say that, but let me tell you more about the major steps of the Eurasian Economic Union. And the first steps, from my personal perspective, should be the diversification of its export structure, because if the Eurasian Economic Union wants to attract the foreign partners like ASEAN, like South Korea, like India, the first thing is actually the diversification of export, which go from Eurasian Economic Union member states. Once again, 54% is the mineral resources and 80% is the intermediate goods. So if you try to sign the free trade agreement, especially the free trade agreement plus with countries with partners in Great Eurasia like China, like ASEAN, you have to have actually a very strong card to offer. And this card is actually the diversified export structure with not just the mineral resources, but more highly valued products with highly value-added products, right? The second part is actually the diversification and giving more competences to Eurasian Economic Commission. Once again, the limitation of Eurasian Economic Commission by negotiating only on trade is a structural limitation which is definitely have to be fixed in the foreseeable future in order Eurasian Economic Union can have more leverage in Greater Eurasia in terms of negotiating with its major partners, like once again, like ASEAN, India, China, whatever. So the third thing is definitely about the foreign tracks per se. So of course, currently the Eurasian Economic Union is deadly afraid of signing any free trade agreement with China, right? They don't want to sign any free trade agreement, right? So that's why this can be actually a story, maybe not the free trade agreement, the preferential trade agreement with China, but the preliminary free trade agreement with different restrictions, with the very flexible period of the implementation of this one. And only by dealing with these things, only by handling these structural limitations of Eurasian Economic Union, Eurasian Economic Commission, in foreseeable future, Eurasian Economic Union will be ready to go to the so-called the integration of integration forums, with handling and dealing with different trade organizations like ASEAN or European Union, which is currently is impossible due to the political contradictions and due to the limitation, the structural limitation of Eurasian Economic Union. So thank you very much for attention, and at the end of our presentations, I will be very happy to answer questions.
Great, thank you for the presentation, and also for kicking us off in such a lively, engaging, and timely manner. Our next presenter is Glenn, is it Dyson or Dyson? You can correct me, who's Associate Professor at the University of Southeastern Norway. The floor is yours.
Thank you. You can hear me now, right? Sorry, not usually using Teams. Yes, Dyson is correct. My topic is a bit now for an article as a work in progress, so any input or help that can help me plug some of the holes would be appreciated. So the paper is more or less about that Russia's had two major problems in Europe, which has been this excessive economic dependence and expectation to adopt Western norms, and I want to compare this to the Greater Eurasian Initiative. So the title of the I argue that Russia is inclined to develop a greater Eurasia with more symmetry in its economic interdependence, and also without organizing itself around universalist concepts that undermine sovereign equality and also the ability to reproduce its cultural distinctiveness. So I used the term in the title, Common Eurasian Home, a conservative political economy. Obviously, I used the term Common Eurasian Home to contrast with what went wrong in Europe. So the common description of Gorbachev's common European home, as we all know, was this shared European house with several distinctive rooms to house the ideological differences, largely based on the Helsinki Accords, with sovereign equality at its heart, being the first article. Now, in contrast, the US format that prevailed was this concept of Europe whole and free, as a European house with one large room based on universalist values and liberal democratic norms, then under US leadership. So obviously, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia lost much of its power, influence, and we ended up with, well, the American version of one room. And from there on, the Helsinki Accords began its decay. Due to a contradiction, that is, as you have these two components within the Helsinki Accords, which was sovereign equality and human rights, and they became to some extent mutually contradictory in such a format, where Russia was not part of the new Europe. That is, human rights largely used to organize relations between the West and Russia in this subject-object relationship between a teacher and a student. And as the West took on this role to socialize or civilize Russia towards desired norms, the entire concept of sovereign equality more or less collapsed, as the West had the prerogative to interfere in the domestic affairs of other states, while to a large extent, or in the same format, Russia had little to any legitimate influence beyond its own borders. So this interference in sovereign inequality is primarily used for subversion due to power competition, as opposed to solely pursuing altruistic values and ideals. So it's important to note that the system of economic interdependence enabled sovereign inequality to be undermined. So to be more specific, it was a system of extreme asymmetrical interdependence, as Russia was excessively reliant on the West, while the West had little dependence on Russia. Pretty much the only dependence has been Russian energy, which the West has made great efforts to reduce to further skew the symmetry of interdependence in its own favor. So the ongoing collapse of the pan-European order is thus becoming more evident as sovereign equality is gone, which is also why Russia is withdrawing from this greater European idea and instead embracing greater Eurasia. So, as Russia is now looking towards this greater Eurasia, principally in the partnership with with China, and the issue of values and powers must yet again find some kind of a harmonization, which is also problematic due to the asymmetries between the Chinese and Russians. So how can we avoid the problem of sovereign inequality in greater Eurasia? Well, multipolarity requires consideration for both conservative values as well as a balance of dependence in the economic sphere. So in Greater Eurasia, the element of universalism appears to be rejected by all the major parties who insist on preserving cultural distinctiveness. So you don't have this overarching ideology such as liberalism in the West that's used to justify universal principles that can diminish sovereign equality. So this can aptly be defined as conservatism to the extent the objective is to reproduce distinctive cultural identities and not merely merge civilization into a common cultural space along the model of the European Union. So to pursue the objective of a conservative political economy, it's important to uphold a multipolar order between sovereign equals, which also very much reflects the language commonly out of Russia, and political economy for a multipolar conservative Greater Eurasia demands a balance of dependence. Now, Russia should obviously avoid excessive reliance on unfavorable asymmetrical partnerships where Russia is more reliant than the other party. Now, China is obviously the most important partner for Russia in Greater Eurasia. However, the stability and durability of this partnership can obviously be challenged by the very unfavorable power or the symmetry of interdependence. Now, this requires a certain degree of, or can be resolved at least with a certain degree of strategic autonomy of Russia by enjoying some technological sovereignty, control over key transportation corridors such as Arctic, and also autonomy over some financial institutions and tools as opposed to solely adopting Chinese instruments. So replacing American with Chinese. Now, the advantage for Russia is obviously also the ability to diversify. So what I call the balance of dependence, which tends to work in Russia's advantage in Greater Eurasia. So by naturally moving Greater Eurasia towards this multipolar format. So exactly because China is economically more powerful state, other states on the Greater Eurasian continent, be it Japan, India, or even European states from Germany, France, most of the other states in Eurasia has some strategic incentives to establish more economic connectivity with Russia to prevent it from becoming excessively reliant on China. So this is something that we're already seeing being expressed and as well as happening, which must be said is quite contradictory or opposite to what's been the case in Europe, where essentially all the major European states have had systemic incentives to exclude Russia for the same reasons. There's been no benefit to include it in the key institutions, while in Greater Eurasia we see a lot of this reversed quite dramatically. So under this new balance of dependence in Greater Eurasia, Russia will also be in a position to more confidently reproduce its cultural distinctiveness and avoid formats of governance that compels it to adopt the cultural trait or norms of foreign powers. I'm not sure I'll do on time, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Right on time. So thank you for that perspective. Next, we go to Professor Kwik Cheng-Chui. Excuse me for mangling your name, who's Associate Professor and Head of the Center for Asian Studies at the National University of Malaysia. Professor, the floor is yours.
Right. Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman, Professor Cooley, and good afternoon or good evening to everyone, depending on where you are. As you could see from the slides, my presentation will focus on China-Southeast Asia relations. And you might be wondering, why should we care about Southeast Asia, a region of small and weak countries in the southern part of Asia? And I think the reasons are multiple. Let me just highlight two big important ones, which is this is a region of growing geo-economic and also growing geopolitical importance. So geopolitically, Southeast Asia is really becoming a region where great powers meet. not just US and China competing, but you could see other second-tier powers, including Quad member countries, are also including, and EU powers, one after another, are also encroaching or engaging in the region. And then geoeconomically, we also know that even during the COVID era last year, Southeast Asia as a whole has become China's largest trading partner, replacing EU. And this trend is likely to continue. And as my friend Alex mentioned earlier on, RCEP was launched last year. And again, this is going to add to the geo-economic importance of the region, as well as ASEAN's linkages with all the competing powers, Russia included. So with this background in mind, let me structure my presentation into 3 parts. And the first part, and that's where my main argument is all about. My main argument is that although China as a rising power influence is growing in Southeast Asia, but this growing influence is one of paradoxical. So in my first part, I would illustrate why I argue that China's growing influence is a paradoxical one. And on that basis, my second part will be about how to disaggregate the Chinese influence, whereby I'm going to identify 3 major approaches in which China has acquired and accumulated the influence in Southeast Asia. And similar logic can be observed about China's growing influence in region other than Southeast Asia. And finally, I'm going to talk about how to measure Southeast Asians' responses. And I have a number of parameters to unpack ASEAN countries' responses vis-a-vis China's growing power. And I'll have only 1 slide each for this particular issue. Next slide, please. So about China's growing paradoxical influence. Usually we define influence as the ability of an actor to attain or pursue desired behavior changes on the part of the target actors, and also to gain or acquire favorable outcomes in a particular region. So in this case, we are seeing a mixed situation when it comes to China's growing activities and also presence in Southeast Asia. On the one hand, we have seen that China's growing activism in multiple sectors, economic sector, security, diplomatic, have grown in a big way. And you could see China's presence in everywhere. And it does have some impact on the part of ASEAN countries' policy choices, things that I'm going to elaborate towards the end. But on the other hand, you could also see that Southeast Asian countries, as smaller countries, are very cautious about China's growing presence. So one good example would be China would like to see Southeast Asia as its own backyard for historical reasons, for geographical reasons. But on the part of ASEAN countries, Southeast Asian countries, we are actually not comfortable even about the term. After all, nobody want to be the backyard of anyone. And all of us will want to be the front partners of everyone in order to have a space in one way or another. And hence, it's very appropriate and also important for us to move on and also to try to unpack China's influence and also ASEAN countries' responses. Next slide, please. I will have a simple table to illustrate both dimensions. So here about the disaggregating China's influence. So you could see that it's about different tool of statecraft. What kind of instruments that rising power, in this case China, try to expand its influence? It's in the DNA of all big powers. China is not the first, it's not going to be the last to actually expand its presence and also its influence. But the choice of policy instruments, the tools, vary. So in this case, and particularly on China-Southeast Asia interactions, you do see, I think I would, to make things simpler and hopefully more systematic, I would group China's tool of statecraft into 3 categories, what I call as 3 I's: infrastructure, institutions, and the discourse of interdependence. So 3 I's. So they represent a different type of tool of statecraft. For example, infrastructure would be a very much economic and also a developmental tool. So a Belt and Road Initiative and the related activities belong to this particular category. So they go hand in hand with other tool of statecraft, for example, institutions. And this is something that I think China has done, I would say, more than any other powers in investing in Southeast Asia and also beyond, in trying to use bilateral and also, more importantly, multilateral or even minilateral diplomacy to expand its influence. So examples of this institutional tool of statecraft would include, for example, AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and also involve some sub-regional cooperation, for example, Lancang Mekong Cooperation. And then the third type of instrument is about interdependence. And this is more about discursive, it's about propaganda. So through a variety of bilateral and multilateral diplomacy, China has tried to emphasize and also to internalize the kind of interdependence situation between China and also the smaller countries in the neighborhood. And then notions or discourse narrative such as a community of common destiny, and that's one perfect example of how and why China tried to sell the point that ASEAN country and China are interdependent in more than one way, and since we are interdependent, we need to take care of each other's interests in one way or another. And then these three tool of statecraft involve different kind of logics. For example, infrastructure BRI would involve primarily remunerative, and then institutions will be about persuasive. It's about interactions, about socialization, and also persuasion. And finally, interdependence, as I mentioned earlier on, is more about discursive. And all three tool of statecraft involve multiple level of interactions. For example, some are through bilateral, some are multilateral, and some are minilateral. With that, let me move on to my final slides. How about ASEAN countries? How do we actually respond to China's multiple tool of statecraft? I think this can take a long time. And again, to make things simpler, I have come up with this table. Contains three parameters that we could use as measurement. And you could use that to measure China's growing influence, to what extent China is influential in a certain region or certain issues. And you can also use that to measure smaller countries' responses. So these three parameters are what I have listed on the left: soliciting cooperation, to what extent small countries are collaborating with China. And the second parameter is about securing conformity, to what extent we actually confirm and agree and stick to what we have agreed upon. And finally, it's about shaping the attitudes about certain issues. And these three parameters can be operationalized through different type of issues, depending on how contentious those issues are. So you could see from the table, from the slide, there are multiple issues of a different nature. Those which are minimally or very less contentious, things like, for example, AIIB, multilateral development institution, you could see that all ASEAN countries are very receptive. We are among those, along with many other countries like in South Asia and also Central Asia and elsewhere, including Europe, of course, including Russia, to be members of AIIB, and that shows how receptive we are. And similarly, we are also quite receptive about other arrangements like Xiangshan Forum. But we are mixed and also more cautious about other arrangements, like, for example, Lancang Mekong Institution, in which many mainland Southeast Asia countries actually see it in a very cautious way. Thailand, for example, Vietnam, for example, are worrying that China's initiative is going to encroach into their own influence at the regional level. And what is more contentious is about the security cooperation. For example, China-ASEAN Maritime Cooperation is something that ASEAN countries are not entirely comfortable. And whenever ASEAN countries are forging cooperation with China, we would make sure that we are also having some similar arrangement with other competing powers. And let me move on. For other parameters, you could see also a mixed situation in which when it comes to securing conformity, issues that are less contentious, like, for example, Tibet, we all defer to China. We all say that we are not going to violate our commitment about one China when it comes to Tibet. And issues like Taiwan and Hong Kong, we generally kind of keep quiet, silent about what is going on in Hong Kong, for example. And we have also been very cautious about Taiwan. So in a way, you can say that we are largely showing deference to China. But on Xinjiang, you do see some mixed situation. Some countries, like for example, Malaysia, has adopted a mixed situation in which we have openly deferred to China, but quietly, privately adopted a very defiant approach. For example, we have actually agreed to Turkey's request to dispatch those Uyghurs who are in Malaysia into Turkey rather than back to China. So finally, my final point is that about shaping attitudes. Again, you could see that depending on the issues, there are different reactions on the part of ASEAN countries. For example, 5G, it's a relatively, because of the power gap, because of the capability gap, you could see that ASEAN countries generally have accepted the 5G as the choice of cooperation. Of course,
Professor,
there are some
time. So if I could ask you just to wrap up with your final comments.
Sure. So my final comment, it would be related to the final examples that I'm highlighting in the bottom line of this table. So this mixed situation on the part of all 10 ASEAN countries, you could see that all ASEAN countries are hedging vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis a big power competition, but we all are hedged in different manners through a different mechanism, and we all are hedged to different degree, meaning that countries like, for example, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Singapore are hedging much more heavier than the rest of the region. And clearly the example or the reasons have to do with domestic politics. But with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So our final panel speaker today will be Professor Evgeny Kanaev, who is on the Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs at the Higher School of Economics. Professor Kanaev, the floor is yours. Oh, and I believe you're on mute. Professor Kanaev, could you unmute?
Well,
there you go.
Is everything all right now? I suppose it is. Well, I'm going to speak about the most important instruments to stimulate pan-Eurasian multilateral projects, and specifically I am going to address ASEAN Business Advisory Council and SCO Business Council as key institutions that stimulate business-to-business cooperation in the ASEAN and SCO territorial domains. The next slide, please. And much has been said and written about possibilities to energize or possibly re-energize cooperation between ASEAN and SCO, and arguably the top-down vector is conspicuously missing and is not as efficient as possibly some experts expected, because functional similarities between SCO and ASEAN in fact do not stimulate upward trends, do not stimulate cooperation, and these things are not interrelated. Also, I would argue that both ASEAN and SCO will have to focus upon their internal priorities, and specifically ASEAN will be busy developing its key prospective project, the ASEAN community, and with relevance to SCO, I suppose that this multilateral dialogue platform will focus upon its internal tasks and specifically territorial contradictions between China, India, and Pakistan. And arguably, SCO has emburdened itself with problems that the Shanghai 5, as well as later on SCO, was able to resolve at the initial stage of its evolution, I mean territorial disputes. And this is what makes SCO, or at least made SCO, different from, for example, ASEAN and ASEAN Regional Forum, since ASEAN has been busy resolving these contradictions, while SCO was able to do it at its initial stage. And finally, both ASEAN and SCO encounter visionary deadlocks. What I really mean is this. Take, for instance, ASEAN. Now it's trying to increase its global significance and is looking at the global level. But what does it see there? I suppose it sees the exactly same things that ASEAN wanted to avoid when ASEAN tried to establish ASEAN Regional Forum. I mean that promising economic projects are sacrificed for the sake of political expediency. And with the specific relevance to SCO, take for instance the events that took place in February 2019 when India and Pakistan were engaged in a military clash. Two SCO members, and India didn't consider it necessary to consult with its SCO partners before it attacked Pakistan. And specifically, the next slide, please. Turning to business cooperation, I can say that just a moment, I want to change this presentation since this is not what I prepared for this session. Could you please allow me to?
Yeah, sure. Why don't you?
Just a moment.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose now you can see my presentation well. Is everything all right now?
Perfect.
Well, and specifically, as far as the business side of things is concerned, ASEAN and SCO have their institutions specifically tasked to deal with business problems. So this is ASEAN Business Advisory Council and SCO Business Club. And with relevance to
and perhaps presentation mode, Professor Kanaev, so we can see it on the big screen. Thank you. Well,
is everything all right now? I deeply apologize for these technical setbacks, but now we can continue, right?
It's okay. Yeah, we can still. Okay. But it's okay. We can make it out. I don't want to take or interrupt you again. So that's.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much indeed. And as you see, both ASEAN Business Advisory Council and SCO Business Council have been able to establish both the organizational and institutional tracks of their activity. They were established relatively a long time ago, and so far they have already been able to test the limits of the possible since, for example, ASEAN established its programs, specifically ASEAN Business Awards and ASEAN Business Leadership Program. Also, SCO established SCO Business Forum and other organizational venues. And apart from it, both ASEAN Business Advisory Council and SCO Business Club met in the prospective plans of ASEAN and SCO respectively. And here, in theory, there are prospects for cooperation, but discouragingly, this is not what we see in practice, because limitations are really strong, and the most important of them are as follows. In fact, cooperation between ASEAN and SCO lacks a very important component. I would say that this is regionalization. This is the grassroots level cooperation. I mean exchanges between companies and financial structures, between individual entrepreneurs, etc. And this is a factor which discourages cooperation between companies since the grassroots level is conspicuously missing. Also, ASEAN has been unable to specify what exactly it means by saying a single production base. ASEAN, as you know, declared the ASEAN Economic Community, and a single market and a single production base are among the key components of ASEAN Economic Community. But we can understand what ASEAN single market means, but what ASEAN means by saying a single production base is unclear. There is no ASEAN automobile or ASEAN smartphone or something like this that would integrate the efforts of all ASEAN member states. And in its turn, SCO has been unable to launch the so-called anchor projects that would allow SCO member states to further increase and multiply cooperation, including between companies. Also, there is a conspicuous lack of institutional channels since ASEAN Business Advisory Council doesn't have a specific institutional track to deal with SCO. There is no such thing as ASEAN SCO Business Council. And also SCO Business Council doesn't specifically distinguish ASEAN as an individual and a self-sufficient track of its activity. But most importantly, this cooperation lacks the digital component, since the cross-national channels, the cross-national tracks of economic commerce, is also missing. What I really mean is not limited to B2B or B2C tracks. Also, there are government to citizens as well as citizens to government, and also customer to customer individual tracks, which are also responsible for stimulating contacts between individual businessmen and between companies. And I argue that this is missing even at the level of ASEAN and SCO, not to say about cooperation between them. And speaking about the most realistic scenario, what can be done to energize or possibly re-energize cooperation between ASEAN and SCO business communities, I can say that this is about large-scale geopolitical projects. But the Indo-Pacific region and arguably the Greater Eurasian Partnership cannot meet this demand, cannot meet these expectations, since very important components are missing. But this is not to say about the Belt and Road Initiative, and in my opinion, this is the most likely game changer. And specifically, as far as the Belt and Road Initiative is concerned, I can say that China has been able to develop the grassroots cooperation. China has populous diasporas, China has recognizable brands. Chinese companies are very active in both Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and since recently South Asia. We know that China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is a very promising multilateral initiative. And China may well synergize the Belt and Road Initiative and the ASEAN-led and the SCO-led initiatives, and this is a very likely scenario. Also, China is busy developing its supplementary initiatives. I mean, the Digital Silk Road and the Health Silk Road as separate BRI tracks. And arguably, this is about setting international industrial standards of cooperation, and as these activities mature, China will be able to raise the issue of setting industrial standards, and in the present day world, these standards include the digital component. But most importantly, at present, China raises the following question. Okay, we cannot resolve contradictions which appear in the internet between different companies, and the legal aspects how to regulate digital economic exchanges are conspicuously missing. And in these specific circumstances, let's make, for example, Alibaba or Tencent or other Chinese digital companies the lawmakers in resolving these contradictions and eventually in regulating the legal side of economic exchanges. And as this practice goes on, I mean, China will become even more active along this specific track. And to conclude, I can say that at present, the institutional and the digital assets to stimulate cooperation between ASEAN and SCO are missing. And the most important lesson is not possibly unique, but it is nevertheless very important. The regionalism, I mean institutions, cannot exist without the regionalization, I mean grassroots exchanges. And China is likely to become the key game changer in bringing ASEAN Business Advisory Council and SCO Business Council together. This is the reality, not a reality, but the reality that we will have to accept. And my final remarks are about critical questions. Speaking about multilateral trans-regional...
Sorry, Professor, we're almost at time. We are over time, so if you could just please wrap up and conclude. I'm sorry.
Okay, very briefly. Are multilateral trans-regional projects doomed to fail because instrumental deficiencies are inevitable? In order to implement really an efficient mega projects, should it be operated from one center? And China, as the benefit provider, is also a likely scenario. Yes, but at what price? This is what I wanted to say, and my final remark is traditional. Thank you very much. And once again, colleagues, this presentation has been prepared in the co-authorship with Ekaterina Vasileva. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So now we move to our discussant commentators, each of who will have 10 minutes. And again, I will give a 1 minute left signal at 9 minutes. We want to ensure that we have at least some time for comments. So our first discussant is Dmitry Efremenko, who's the Deputy Director, Head of the Center for Academic Research and Informational Studies in Social Sciences at the Russian Academy of Sciences. Dr. Efremenko, the floor is yours for your comments.
Thank you, Professor Cooley. Dear colleagues, I would like to discuss the first two papers. This is a kind of labor division with Professor Xin Jiang, who will discuss the last two papers. Let me start with a paper presented by Glenn Deason. In my opinion, Glenn offers a very interesting and promising interpretation of the relationship between the idea of Greater Eurasia, its ideological message, and geo-economic content. In this regard, I would like to discuss some points. First, the modern concepts of Greater Eurasia and the turn to the East have primarily pragmatic foundations. To understand them, it's necessary to take into account the international context of the previous decade. First of all, the Ukrainian crisis, the growing confrontation between Russia and the West, and the rise of China. The Chinese One Belt, One Road initiative will usher in a new kind of competition between countries contending for Chinese investments and loans, and those that want to host transport infrastructure to secure the unity of macro-region. But what is even more important is that the process China has launched is acquiring its own inner logic, and other countries are doubling their efforts to build their own value-added change. So the development of Greater Eurasia is beginning to look like a process of self-organization. Premises for such development emerged a long time ago, but there were no proper conditions until now. This is objective side. Second point, Russia has to respond to this transformation and can influence them significantly. The problem is that regional and global contradictions are also growing and becoming increasingly complex, affecting not only security, economic, trade and financial spheres, but also information flows, virtual space, culture, political ideologies, and so on. Russia may be one of those who will benefit from building a Greater Eurasia, At the same time, there is a danger of turning into the main magnet for risks and threats in this process. In my view, we are observing this tendency right now. At the same time, the concept of Greater Eurasia has an ideological basis. In a broad sense, it's a search for an alternative to the West-centric liberal world order. In principle, the idea of Greater Eurasia is a kind of result of the emancipation of Russian foreign policy thinking from the Western paradigm. I agree with Glenn that Greater Russia is a conservative idea too. That's so. Indeed, the values of sovereignty, reasonable economic protectionism, promoting traditional social institutions are among the basis logical premises of this idea. In this context, just one remark concerning early tradition of Russian Eurasianism of 1920s. In my view, the influence of this ideological movement on the modern concept of Greater Eurasia is rather limited, but the main idea of early Eurasianists sounds very relevant today. Indeed, the development of Russia should be based on what distinguishes it from other countries, namely geography, history, cultural and economic peculiarities. Russia can achieve economic success due to its geographical position between Europe and Asia as interaction between these two centers of global economic growth. Don't forget that the leading representative of this school of thinking, Nikolai Trubetskoy, in many aspects foresaw the future direction of development of regionalism and integrational process in Eurasia. Instead of a system of autarchic economies of national states, Trubetskoy proposed to form a system of specific wards or regions as the main elements of the global economy. From this point of view, Greater Eurasia is a search for a model of regionalism within which, I absolutely agree with Glenn, Russia would like to keep a separate room and ensure its strategic autonomy. However, this room is not only for Russia, but also for a number of post-Soviet countries which, due to various factors, are ready to maintain exclusive relations with Russia. It's truly a separate room in relation to the European Union, but also in relation to the Sino-centric world. The latter is important despite the fact that Moscow will strengthen strategic partnership with Beijing. Also, Russia will have sharply increase its technological dependence on China and in many cases integrated into China-led value chains. Nevertheless, it's important for Russia and other countries of post-Soviet space that they separate room would have several windows, not only window to Europe, but also windows to the east and south. And the idea of the integration of integrations also contribute to the achievement of this goal. In this regard, I would like to make a couple of remarks on the paper presented by Alexander Korolov. The Eurasian Economic Union, as a separate room, needs to form a diversified system of economic ties and partnerships with external economic actors. Of course, this requires creativity and flexibility, but also sufficient capability of supranational integrational institutions, first of all, the Eurasian Economic Commission. The success of Eurasian regional integrational project to a great extent depends on whether the particular interest of certain states will prevail in this case, or their interest will be coordinated to the objective of multiracial cooperation of the EU countries. Such sensitive questions as custom regulation, protection of domestic market and producer regulation of condition of access for external players to the transport infrastructure and energy markets of the EU countries can be solved in the most effective way with appropriate consolidated approach of participants of Eurasian integration. I agree with Alexander that law-based effect, the years of Eurasian Economic Union is already over. Of course, EU needs to extend its toolkit in the field of international economic and trade cooperation. The toolkit should include not only classical FTA, free trade agreement, but also FTA plus and different modalities of integration deals. Just one probably final remark concerning harmonization of Belt and Road Initiative and EU. This process should be considered as a peculiar examination on efficiency and political maturity for both EU institutions and post-Soviet elites. The possible next step from already signed non-preferential trade agreement with China to interim agreement leading to the formation of FTA with China would not be easy. On the one hand, Alexander is right, a more advanced trade and economic agreement with China can become an effective way to minimize the negative consequences of pandemic crisis. But on the other hand, the EU countries are weakened by the crisis to a much greater extent than Chinese one. So in this case, we must be very careful, but I agree, it's time to start discussion free trade regime between China and Eurasian Economic Union. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed for that, and also for the coordination amongst the discussants with the papers. So our second discussant is Professor Xin Zhang, Associate Professor at the School of Advanced International Area Studies at East China Normal University. Professor, the floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Thank you. Can you hear me well? Okay, good.
Yes, loud and clear. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So thank you for having me on this panel. I will comment the third and the fourth paper, starting with the paper on unpacking China's influence in Southeast Asia. I think the paper overall provides a great amount of detail and information about how to provide useful typologies for both China's influence in this region and different Southeast Asian country response to increasing Chinese influence in this region. I've read the author's other piece on hedging strategies by Southeast Asian countries. I think this is a very nice follow-up on the author's other work. So having said that, I have a few points, both as a comment, critical comments and a possible suggestion. One minor point to start off is they also emphasize that sort of in the Chinese the discourse or geopolitical visions, it tends to regard the Southeast Asian countries or this region as its backyard. That sounds a little bit weird to me, because for at least as far as I know, the Chinese traditional narrative about the Southeast Asia has, if not never, has rarely used the concept backyard. I'm not trying to portray China as or benevolent power in the region, but the idea of treating East Asian or the region as the China's so-called backyard is it's just not visible to me. Maybe there's a better way to summarize China's traditional vision about this region. Second, on to a very useful, very rich table, I have some questions and maybe suggestion for revision. Well, on the first table, because I didn't have those table beforehand, so I just only have it on my cell phone. The disaggregating China's influence. I think that the cell, the upper right corner of the cell, independence and the tools of statecraft, that doesn't seem to be very reasonable. Why interdependence as a statecraft is predominantly discursive? interdependence can describe a very much part of the reality. For example, the two parties, the two countries are heavily interdependent in terms of how much they trade with each other, how much they invest in each other. So I wouldn't. It's not very convincing to me that that this cell should be discursive. That's one. Second is maybe this is because in the presentation there's not enough time to elaborate on. The second line, logics of interaction, they also put exogenous in the first remunerative as exogenous, and then persuasive as exogenous, endogenous. I don't quite get that. What does it refer to? This is my question for the first table. The second table, unpacking Southeast Asian country responses. It's very rich, but for my own taste, a little bit too rich, because it's a 3x3 two-dimensional table. But if you look at the cell, essentially introduce several multiple other dimensions. So I don't know whether there is a better way to provide a typology and summarize these country response in a more concise way, rather than introduce receptive, positive, mixed, divergent, cautiously positive, deference, largely deference, pragmatic, adaptive. So I cannot think of a better way right now, but I think maybe helpful to streamline the content in these tables. One last, both as a question and maybe a clarification question is, I think there's great potential to work on these tables, but I don't know what's the next step they also might be taking, because if the paper just stays at this way, I feel that something is not finished yet. Maybe you can provide a linkage between the first table and the second table. It's just different type of Chinese influence would endanger certain responses from Southeast Asian countries. That could be one way to go. Just provide some causal linkage between the first table and the second table might be one way to further substantiate the analytical depths of the paper, on top of what the very useful, very rich typology has already provided, and to close off as an analytical paper. So that's personally I would love to see to further develop. So this is my comments for the first one. The second one, unfortunately, I didn't see some of the slides after the first slides, so I'll build on what I hear, and also the extended abstract I received in advance. This topic is actually quite new to me, even though they also mentioned the discussion of ASEAN-SCO collaboration has been discussed with a varying degree of intensity since 2005. But for me, maybe I'm not following the topic close enough. I just haven't heard or read much about this intensive discussion on that. So why to raise this topic in the first place may need some justification. It's not a very logical or very natural pair of collaboration to start with, at least to me. And also, they also mentioned there was expectation because the two regional institutions share some similarities of organizational structure, and then there's an expectation they will naturally find it easier to collaborate. And I think theoretically this seemed to be also a little bit weak. I don't know whether there is a strong prior theory foundation to argue regional organizations would find it easier to collaborate when they share certain similar organizational structure. So maybe that point can be tightened up with the correct sufficient reference to the theoretical foundations. And another key point, part of the author's key conclusion, if I get, is towards the end, the key conclusion seemed to be is the author tried to argue that regionalism. Now I'm quoting from the article, the extended abstract, that the regionalism institutions of cooperation can only be premised upon the regionalization, grassroots exchanges. This seemed to be a key conclusion. But I wonder whether the use of both regionalism and the regionalization in this context is a little bit too loose and not exact enough, because for what I understand, regionalization seemed to be a more broader concept, which oftentimes also incorporates collaboration or merging of formal institutions. So if that's correct, it at least doesn't just mean grassroots exchange. On the one hand, on the other hand, it's hard to say that regionalism needs to be built on regionalization, because obviously the institution of cooperation is part of what we usually mean by regionalization, right? So that's another point I want to raise. And also another very minor point about wording. They also refers to upward trends between these two regional organizations several times, and I don't know whether that's commonly used special terms to describe the relation between two regional organizations. It's not something I feel particularly familiar with. Maybe it's a translation from a Russian word, so they also may want to check on that. And also one last point is, in the title of the paper abstract, at least I received, the subtitle has two components: institutional and digital dimensions. And for both the return extended abstract and also the presentation we hear today, the focus is obviously on the institutional side, but we see and hear very little about the digital dimensions. Whether that's something they also plan to take out of the final paper project, or maybe it's just missing. Maybe they also need some justification of the title, if you still want to keep the digital dimension as part of the key analysis, right? And I think that this paper, in the format, is more of a policy paper, which has its own legitimate sort of a legitimate foundation for sure. But I personally would like to see a little bit more reference or more conversation with some of the key academic literatures on regionalism and on the interaction between different regional organizations. That could potentially provide the analysis with a more stronger theoretical or conceptual, provide some more theoretical and conceptual leverage. Even the primary goal of this paper is to do a policy paper type of analysis. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Super, thank you. So we have about 20 minutes for questions and comments. I'm going to ask the paper presenters to hold off on responding, and what we'll do is we will get some comments and questions from the participants. We will bundle those together, and then when we go back to you, I'll give you each about 3-4 minutes to address both the respondents and any questions that you might find of interest. So let's take questions. I don't know if the norm has been you've been using the raise hands feature okay, so let's do the raise hands feature. Anything from the audience? Okay, I'm not seeing anything. So in which case, then let's go back to the panelists for a response. Let's say 4 minutes each to either respond to the other panelists or to your discussant. Professor Korolev, you're first up.
Yeah, once again, thank you very much for the comments, for the criticism, constructive criticism. Yeah, so definitely, when I personally will elaborate more on this topic about the Eurasian Economic Union, I will dive deep more into the details of whether it is possible in the foreseeable future to have any negotiations with China on free trade agreement, what kind of possible triggers could be used to do that, what kind of mechanisms should be used to do that. Definitely we'll elaborate more on the foreign experience of different trade associations, and first of all on the ASEAN, right? Because the ASEAN is also a very sensitive question in terms of the dealing with China, in terms of the huge trade deficit actually with China. But at the same time, the benefits which separate countries take, for example, Malaysia or Singapore or Vietnam, right? How to overflow with export, different export of intermediate goods, and this at the same time on the electronics, right? And what I will also elaborate, and thank you very much, Dmitry, for your comments, is the the trade war, right? So, and how the Eurasian Economic Union is handling the trade war issues between the U.S. and China, and definitely what kind of possibilities the Eurasian Economic Union get in terms of under this trade war, right? Because we can definitely see the different trade associations like Mercosur or ASEAN or even European Union to a certain degree, how they use this trade diversion, which emerges after the trade war between the U.S. and China. What kind of possibilities the trade war open for the markets of, especially for the rising markets like ASEAN countries like Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore, or Thailand as well. So I will dive deep more into these details, and as well on the, of course, on the so-called conjuncture between the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, and Eurasian Economic Union, because I didn't actually focus a lot on this question, but this is definitely very important one. Also, given the fact that the Greater Eurasian Partnership is still a very vague concept, right? Even in terms of the economy, the geostrategic thing. That's why I will try to dive deep more into the details of this Greater Eurasian Partnership and what kind of Eurasian Economic Union, what kind of role the Eurasian Economic Union plays in this geostrategic and geoeconomic landscape. So thank you very much for your comments. I do appreciate, and I hope with your help I will elaborate my thesis more detailed and nuanced.
Thank you very much, Professor Deason.
Yes, thanks, and yeah, thank you for the feedback as well. Yeah, I guess a very good feedback is this comment on that a lot of these Greater Eurasian projects are influenced by internal dimensions. So I guess that's one of the key things. I'm looking at as well in terms of first on the economic front, the different economic interests, which makes a lot of the Greater Eurasian formats competing to some extent, as we know. Obviously, they have some larger contrasts. For example, with India, which tries to balance itself a little bit between the Indo-Pacific and the Greater Eurasian initiatives. But even for countries largely aligned, such as China and Russia, you have this, for example, Russia seeking to develop its furthest eastern regions, while China prioritizing developing its western internal regions. So you have this domestic considerations which are influencing the actual partnership. And the same applies for the so-called value component or ideals. So yes, you see most of the major actors participating are largely entering this with certain conservative concepts about distinctiveness of culture and civilization. However, this being also different to some extent, and also the expectations to which it would influence the actual structures and purpose of the Greater Eurasian format. Yeah, anyways, yeah, thank you for the comments.
Thank you. Next, we move to Professor Cheng Chui.
All right, thanks very much. Thank you, Professor Chung, for your very spot-on comments and also a very constructive criticism. I like particularly your suggestions actually to simplify table 2, the 3x3, and also to perhaps establish the causal linkages between table 1 and table 2. As you could see, this is still a very much a work in progress, and I do like those comments, and I would definitely use them to revise further. So with the remaining time, if I could, let me respond very quickly to the 3 points that you mentioned about endogenous versus exogenous, and also about the backyard issue, and also about the discuss interdependence as a discursive tool. So about endogenous and also exogenous, I actually use it along the line of rationalist versus constructivist debate, in the sense that exogenous would be primarily materialist-based cost-benefit calculation, and that's very much about the Belt and Road Corporation. That's very clear-cut. Whereby institutions is the platform for endogenous, in the sense that social constructivists will argue that internalization, socializations matter, and you do see those signs between China and also ASEAN countries, on either on the ASEAN-led platform or on the China-centered initiative. So that's the first point, which brings me to the interdependence as the discursive arrangement. And I'm trying just to use that as the distinction from the first I and also the second I. As you could recall, the first I was about infrastructure, second I about the institutions, and also finally interdependence. You could see that all three are interrelated, are mutually reinforcing, they go hand in hand. But because of the different logics, because of the different nature, they do have some distinction. And for example, what Xi Jinping has been trying to promote, the so-called community of common destiny, 命运共同体. If we could only use one word to capture that, it's really about interdependence. And this is something that China, I think, tried to counter the narrative from the West. And this is something that we in Southeast Asia, we notice very clearly. We are seeing a different kind of a narrative, and clearly interdependence is something that China think that because of geographical proximity and also the economic linkages, China has the comparative advantage to emphasize and internalize interdependence notion. Finally, about backyard, I agree with you. Officially, actually, this is not something that China will use, and I don't think China will use it anyway. But I think what really matters is really the reality. So there are certain words that, although China did not use backyard, but it actually shows the backyard mentality. We smaller countries are being regarded as something along the line that some would say a Monroe Doctrine, in the sense that China kind of, for example, Yang Jiechi during a meeting emphasized that China is a big country and ASEAN countries are smaller countries, and emphasize that is just a fact. And then that's a backyard mentality. Finally, the South China Sea issue, for example, China's growing a presence. And in fact, one good example would be Malaysia, right? It's only 30-20 miles from Malaysian side, but thousands miles from China. What we call as a beting serumpai. And we found that we in Southeast Asia, smaller countries, think that if it is not backyard the mentality, why would that justify China from showing that presence and also trying to show force, like for example, Malaysia that is going on in the Philippines, but also elsewhere, try to stop smaller countries from collaborating with other powers. That is simply backyard activities. So I think we'll stop here, but Professor Strong, thanks again for the useful feedback. I certainly will get in touch with you for further inputs. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Kanaev next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much indeed. Well, for the sake of brevity, just the key comments. I want to express my really deep and heartfelt gratitude to the reviewer for his critical remarks, and these remarks will be respectfully taken into consideration. I have fixed all the comments, and I cannot say that I completely agree with everything that has been mentioned. I do not necessarily agree with all the points of criticism, but I understand that the key aim of this criticism is very simple: to make my paper better than it currently is. And once again, thank you very much, and all the remarks and points mentioned will be respectfully taken into consideration. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Just one thing that I noticed in the panel, this interesting comment from Professor Zhang about the neglect of the digital side in a lot of these presentations. I'm wondering, without going over our time, whether anyone had any thoughts about that. Does digital cooperation in terms of its ordering characteristics present any special types of challenges, or rather, does it just continue the types of pathways and mechanisms for cooperation and institutional development that are already pre-existing? So it's a little bit of a curveball question from the chair there, but I do think it's an interesting question that cuts across your presentations, and that's timely. So I don't know if anyone would like to take that.
Maybe just to get the ball rolling, Professor, I think about the digital connectivity in Southeast Asia, for example. Early on, I used briefly about the issue of 5G as an example to show that different ASEAN countries have responded very differently. The fact is that China, it's expanding all sort of connectivity activities, digital being one of it, and Huawei is a big actor in virtually all countries. And except Singapore and also Vietnam, which actually try to diversify. Many other countries, Southeastern countries, actually do not have the kind of alternative. First is that we do not have our own ability to develop. And then we do know the risk, but we simply also feel that we do not have much alternative, and therefore many of us are collaborating with China in one way or another. And then other countries are trying to compete as well. And we are still in that crossroad, in the sense that even during Trump, for example, Trump has already started to talk about decoupling, right? And then clearly decoupling can take many domains, but digital domain is clearly the first and perhaps the most important one. So we believe that even under Biden, this thing will continue. So I think we are ambivalent about it. When we say we, meaning we in Southeast Asia, smaller countries who do not have own capability, we don't have much alternative, but we are ambivalent in the sense that on the one hand, we welcome competition. On the other hand, we are also worried that this might become, if decoupling is really being implemented on ground, are we going to see very different systems starting from digital, expanded to other domain of economic and other activities? And when that happens, we are going to see regional polarization. And even we can deny it is Cold War 2.0, but that would result in the kind of Cold War 2.0 in a different new form. I will stop here.
That's great. Thank you for that. Would anyone else like to weigh in on this? No? Okay, so in that case, I will draw the proceeding to a close. Thank you very much to your panelists for your presentations. So engaging. Thank you to the commentators for their insightful comments. Thank you to all the participants. And I wish everyone a good evening and a good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, colleagues, and thank you, Professor Cooley, for moderating this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, colleagues. All right, take care.
You too.